Is a change as good as a rest? Let me give you a scenario. You are playing a really difficult game and you come upon the first boss. You fight the boss and you die. What do? Well, as the old saying goes, you try again. And maybe after a while, you beat the boss, but you feel this was more due to persistence and luck rather than skill. Player progression is important for game design, as skill development is associated with a variety of positive player experiences. One technique that can improve several kinds of skills is the idea of spaced practice, which suggests that taking breaks between task sessions leads to improved acquisition of skill and better immediate performance. This is often contrasted with continuous practice, which is constant practice with little or no break. This may sound familiar. Last year we presented research on a clone of superhexagon that provided evidence that spaced practice helped players perform better than those who did continuous practice. However, there were several limitations to this study. First, the results do not necessarily provide evidence that spaced practice works in every game type. And second, the study provides little to no information about what players should be doing during breaks. Break-like activities are already present in games, from menus and loading screens, to cutscenes and minigames, to even within gameplay, from simple walking segments to intense boss battles. With these limitations in mind, we came up with 3 research questions. 1. Does spaced practice apply in a more complex game? 2. Does the type of break activity change the effects of spaced practice? And 3. Do different break activities interrupt flow in a game? To address these questions, we needed to create a game that was, first, more complex, and second, allowed for various activities to be integrated naturally. We created our own platformer, where players were required to complete a repeating course by running, jumping, swinging, and grappling. A grapple mechanic was added because it was a mechanic that's not often used in other platformers, and it was easy for players to learn but hard for them to master. Using this game, we conducted 2 experiments, one to determine if spaced practice works in a more complex game, and the other to determine if break activities affect spaced practice. In our first experiment, we had participants play 4 5-minute sessions of our platformer, with 3 breaks in between each session. They were divided randomly into 2 different groups, one spaced practice group that had 2-minute breaks, and a continuous practice group that had 3-second breaks. For the results, did the performance change? Yes, we found that participants did improve at the game during the training session, completing more laps in less time. Now, were there benefits to spaced practice? Yes, the benefits of spaced practice persisted throughout training and in our retention task 1 week later. And did it affect the subjective experience of players? No, we found no significant effect of the breaks on the player's subjective experience. Great, so now we know spaced practice works in our game. Our second experiment, we asked whether the type of break activity affects the benefits of spaced practice. We thought of possible reasons why a break activity may be better or worse for spaced practice. We thought that if a task was too similar to the main task, it wouldn't act as a break, due to it not being any different from what the player was already doing. We also thought that if players were given breaks that required more attention, more button presses and coordination, and overall more intensity than the main gameplay task, it would actually not act as a rest. Based on this criteria, we made 4 different in-game breaks based on having high or low similarity to the main task and being more or less intense than the main task. The 4 breaks were a low similarity, low intensity dialogue scene, a low similarity, high intensity maze minigame, a high similarity, high intensity grapple minigame, and a high similarity, low intensity slow motion version of the grapple minigame. Our second experiment followed the same pattern as the spaced practice condition from experiment 1, using the previously mentioned breaks as 4 separate conditions. Based on our study, we found that neither intensity or similarity affected player performance in games. When comparing the low similarity, low intensity cutscene to the high intensity, high similarity grapple minigame, there were minimal differences, and these minimal differences also appeared in the other 2 conditions as well. But players still improved over time, having significant gains in the beginning and gradually gaining over time, and they retained the skills 1 week later during our retention task. And while there was no significant statistical differences, visually, the low similarity, low intensity cutscene appeared to do the best. But the important thing here is, how did it compare to spaced practice and continuous practice? All 4 breaks were better than continuous practice by a large amount, meaning that the gains from break activities were still used when in space practice. And when compared to our space practice group from Experiment 1, all 4 of our conditions performed as well, if not slightly better, than space practice version in our first experiment. And we found that no version of the 4 breaks affected subjective experience or flow. So to answer our research question, does space practice work in a more complex game? Yes, it does. Does the type of break activity affect player performance? No. And do different break activities interrupt flow? No. So what does this mean? Although our results are not generalizable beyond our platformer, they do suggest that designers can make use of breaks in more complex games to aid skill acquisition, and that they have the freedom to create break activities of their choice without undermining flow. So for players, perhaps the next time you encounter a bonfire, take a breather. The developers may be giving you a change that is as good as a rest.